Oh, hi, I didn't see you there. I was just reading chapter 11 in my biology textbook, all about the forces of evolutionary change. I tried reading it yesterday, but I couldn't understand it all that well. So, I made some phone calls, bought some plane tickets, and went all over the world to talk to university professors about what evolution means. First, I talked to Professor Robert Benjamin at Howard University, just down the street.
Hello, I'm Rob Benjamin. This evening my friends and I are going to cover chapter 11. Personally, I'm going to cover 11.1 while my esteemed colleagues will cover the remainder of the chapter. We only have 50 minutes, so let's get started. At the end of my portion tonight, you should be able to explain evolution, who Charles Darwin is and why he's important, understand the difference between natural selection as well as artificial selection, and lastly explain the modern evolutionary synthesis. Before we jump into all the details, it's important to define evolution. Evolution is the change in inherited characteristics of biological populations over successive generations. It is important to note that it does not occur overnight, taking years and at times millions of years to complete. Evolutionary process gives rise to diversity at every level of biological organization, to include species, individual organisms, and molecules such as DNA and proteins. A great example of this is the peppered moth. Originally, the vast majority of peppered moths had a light molted coloring, which is good against camouflaging against predators. Before the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s, a uniformly dark variant of the peppered moth made up 2% of the species. However, after the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1850s, 95% of peppered moths showed this dark coloration. You see, the light moths lost their advantage of camouflage, as light surfaces were darkened by pollution, and so light moths were more frequently eaten by birds. Now on the famous Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was an English naturalist and geologist, well known for his work on evolutionary theory. He established that all species of life have descended over time from common ancestors, and in a joint publication with Alfred Wallace, he introduced a scientific theory that the branching pattern of evolution resulted from a process he called natural selection, in which the struggle for existence has a similar effect to the artificial selections involved in selective breeding. Now, selective breeding, also called artificial selection, is the process by which humans breed other animals and plants for particular traits. Typically, strains that are selectively bred are domesticated, and the breeding is normally done by a professional breeder. Bred animals are known as breeds, while bred plants are known as varieties. The cross of animals result in what is called a crossbreed. The crossbreed of plants are called hybrids. Now, on the other hand, you have natural selection, which is the gradual process by which biological traits become either more or less common in a population as function of the inherited traits on the differential reproductive success of organisms interacting within their environment. It is a key mechanism of evolution. The term natural selection was popularized by Charles Darwin, who intended on it being compared with artificial selection, now more commonly referred to as selective breeding. So Charles Darwin published his theories of evolution, as I previously said, in his 1859 book on the origin of species, overcoming scientific rejection of earlier concepts of transmutation of species. By the 1870s, the scientific community and much of the general public had accepted evolution as a fact. However, many favored competing explanations, and it was not until the emergence of the modern evolutionary synthesis from the 1930s to the 1950s that a broad consensus developed in which natural selection was the basic mechanism for evolution. Now, Darwin observed three main facts in the natural world around him when he sailed around the world on the HMS Beagle. He saw that organisms produce more offspring than is required to replace themselves. So population should increase rapidly. However, Darwin himself, and he confirmed with his colleagues, that populations tended to stay about the same. You don't see the doubling of the number of frogs or mice in your garden each year, do you? That's fact two. But what accounts for this disparity? Darwin found the answer with another fact: resources. such as food, waters, places to sleep, are made, are limited. A major influence Darwin observed in this fact was his reading on Thomas Malthus, who published a paper stating that the human population was increasing at a rapid pace and would soon run out of food, water, as well as space. These three simple facts, which Darwin put together to draw a simple conclusion: individuals compete with each other for scarce resources. Modern synthesis of evolution is the result of various lines of investigation from the 1920s to the 1950s that supported and reconciled the Darwinian theory of evolution, as well as the Mendelian laws of inheritance in terms of natural selection acting on generic variation. The main takeaways of modern synthesis are as follows. 1. All evolutionary phenomena can be explained in a way consistent with known genetic mechanisms and observable evidence of naturalists. Evolution is gradual. Small genetic changes regulated by natural selection accumulate over long periods of time. Natural selection is by far the main mechanism of change. Even slight advantages are important when continued. And lastly, thinking in terms of populations rather than individuals is primary. The genetic diversity existing in natural populations is a key factor in evolution. The strength of natural selection in the wild is greater than previously expected. The effect of ecological factors such as niche occupation and the significance of barriers, the gene flow, are all important. So this concludes 11.1, and as stated at the beginning of my talk this evening, we stated that you should be able to explain evolution, explain who Charles Darwin is and why he's important. You should now understand the difference between natural selection and artificial selection, as well as modern synthesis. I wish you a good night.
That was great, huh? Next, I traveled all the way to China to hear Minshan Cudair talk about how natural selection molds evolution. Here's what she had to say.
Hi everyone, I'm Professor Cudair. Today I want to talk about natural selection molds evolution. As we know, Charles Darwin was the first to formulate a scientific argument for the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. Biological evolution includes large-scale, so-called macroevolution, such as the appearance of new species. In contrast, microevolution occurs on a much smaller scale, which is the relatively short-term genetic change within a population or species. Natural selection is the most famous and important mechanism of microevolution. Now, let's learn about the basic requirements for natural selection to occur. Firstly, adaptation enhances reproductive success. Organisms of the same species are different from one another, and every population reproduces more individuals than resources can support. It is because that some members of any population will not survive to reproduce. Let's look at the figure 11.6. In this figure, the basketball player is very tall, while the referee is much shorter, which tells us that there are genetic variation within the human population. The dandelions in the picture produces many offspring. Do you think all of them will survive?
Yeah, sure. Will they?
No.
That's so sad.
Yeah, unfortunately, very few survive. The variation inherent in each species means that some individuals in each population are better than others at getting nutrients, water, avoiding predators, tolerating temperature changes, and attracting mates. Adaptation in the evolutionary sense includes only those structures, behaviors, or physiological processes that are heritable and that contribute to reproductive success. In any population, individuals with the best adaptations are most likely to reproduce and pass their advantage to their offspring. Because of this differential reproductive success, a population changes over time with the best available adaptations to the existing environment becoming more common with each generation. Let's look at the figure 11.7. It is about the Staphylococcus aureus bacteria, which can cause serious skin infection. In this picture, the bacteria have no mutation in generation 1 and they are not immune to antibiotic. In generation 2, mutations start to occur and they are immune to the drug. When antibiotic present and after multiple generations, reproduction and selection, which kind of bacteria is more likely to survive? Patrick?
What about the bacteria with the mutation? I'm gonna guess that.
Smart.
I got it right! Yay!
Yes, the presence of an antibiotic strongly select for those bacteria that are immune to the drug. One additional important note is that not all variation within a population is subject to natural selection. For example, the shape of a person's earlobes has little to do with how many offspring he or she is gonna reproduce.
That's good.
Secondly, natural selection eliminates phototypes. Do you know what is phenotypes?
I don't. Could you explain that?
Yeah, an individual's phenotype is observable properties, which includes visible characteristics like your height and eye color. Natural selection indirectly changes allele frequencies in the population. We couldn't tell which phenotype is the best because it depends entirely on the time and place. A trait that is adaptive in one environment may be a liability in one another. Let's look at the figure 11.8. It shows that how the beak of a finch changes according to seasons. On a normal season, seeds are very easy to find, so the population of finch with large beak and finch with small beaks is the same. However, following a very dry season, when seeds are not enough and usually very large and hard to quack, birds with larger beaks are more likely to survive because they are able to open the large and top seeds. This figure shows that within a population, the average bee size can change in as short a time as a year. Thirdly, natural selection does not have a goal. Do you think that natural selection leads to ever more perfect mechanism?
I hope so.
In fact, natural selection has no perfect organism or goal.
Aww.
Because no known mechanism allows the environment to tell DNA how to mutate and generate the allele needed to come from future conditions. Natural selection does not strive for perfection either. If it did, the many kinds of species in life's history would exist. Instead, as we know, more are extinct. Let's look at figure 11.9. The sea scorpions in this figure once existed worldwide, but they became extinct about 250 million years ago. There are several factors that combine to prevent natural selection from producing all of the traits that a species might find useful. First, every genome has limited potential. Second, no population contains every allele needed to confront every possible change in the environment. Third, disasters such as floods and volcanic eruptions can eliminate the best combinations. Finally, some harmful genetic traits are out of natural selection's reach, such as diseases that appear only after reproductive age. What does survival of the fittest really mean? What do you think the fittest individual?
Isn't that a TV show, Survival of the Fittest?
No.
Oh no. No, that's
Do you
Survivor.
think-
Just kidding.
Okay.
I don't know it. What is it, Minshan?
Like a strong, like a lot of people think that the fittest individual is the strongest, fastest, and biggest, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, in an evolutionary sense, fitness refers to an organism's genetic contribution to the next generation.
Oh.
Natural selection promotes any trait that increases fitness, even if the trait virtually guarantees an individual's death. For example, a male menace may not resist if the female begins to eat his head
Oh no.
during copulation. This example shows that an important point. By itself, survival is not enough, because successful reproduction is the only way for an organism to continue its genes. Fitness depends on the ability to survive. Fitness includes not only the total number of offspring produces, but also the proportion that reach reproductive age. We can see that natural selection impacts a lot on evolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Minshan. Next, I traveled to UCLA to meet Susan Walsh. Here's what she had to say. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Susan. It's great to have you.
Hi, Patrick. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely, anytime. All right, so today you're going to talk about evolution and how it's inevitable in our actual populations, right?
You're right. You're
All right,
right.
very
And
good.
it's an honor to join you, such notable biologists, on this discussion.
Yes, our other great professors.
Yeah. So I have some of my reasonings why evolution is inevitable.
Okay,
So
let's hear them.
why don't we begin with by examining a population gene pool.
Okay,
I'd like to start by giving you a few definitions to clarify my discussion.
that's good. I'm going to need that.
Yeah. First of all, let's start with a gene. A
All right.
gene is a sequence of DNA that codes for a specific protein or RNA molecule.
right.
And then we're going to be talking about alleles, and those are one of two or more alternative forms of the gene.
Okay, great.
An allele frequency is the number of copies of that one allele divided
Mhm.
by the number of alleles in the population.
All right, an average.
Yeah, and then
All
the
right.
genotype is an individual's combination of alleles for a particular gene.
Excellent.
And the genotype frequency is the number of the individuals of one genotype divided by the number of individuals in the population.
Like the allele frequency, but with genotypes. Excellent.
Exactly. So evolution, in part, is just a change in these allele frequencies.
Okay.
And from these changes in the frequencies come the genotype frequencies, and these frequencies determine the characteristics of a population.
All right.
So, for example, let's talk about like people from China.
Mhm.
They have alleles causing dark hair, and people from the Netherlands have alleles for blonde hair.
Right.
And these two areas have gene pools that predict common characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take the people from China and interbreed them with those from the Netherlands, the allele frequencies would change.
Right.
So it's
Okay.
these shifts in the allele frequencies of a population that lead to evolution.
Right. So as more breeding happens between people with different gene pools, you're going to get different results, and therefore evolution occurs. Excellent.
Yeah.
All right.
So let's go a little further. The Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which is named for a mathematician, Godfrey Hardy, and
Okay.
a physician, Wilhelm Weinberg,
Mhm.
they state that allele frequencies and genotype frequencies do not change from one generation to the next. This is,
Huh.
it's highly unlikely because they would have to meet the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium conditions, which are
Okay. So there are requirements for this to happen. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
they have to meet all these
All right,
requirements.
what are they?
The first one is mutations do not occur, so new alleles would arise.
But that never happens because
No.
mutations happen all the time.
Exactly.
All right.
Individuals made at random.
Which that never happens because we have spouses, and the chances of you're limited to where you're actually physically are present, because I'm not going to see someone halfway across the world, much less mate with them. But
Exactly.
And,
And individuals do not migrate into or out of a population, which
right.
never happens in our
Right. We're
human.
moving around all the time.
Exactly. And then populations are infinitely large, or at least large enough to prevent genetic drift.
Right.
And
Oh,
that's
yeah.
And then also natural selection does not occur. And we all know that
Yeah.
natural
All the
selection.
time.
All the time, yes. Hardy-Weinberg, back to them, they proposed an expression that P plus Q equal 1. With, and 1 could, this equation would represent the frequency of both alleles for a gene if only 2 alleles exist for that gene.
Okay.
So, yeah, this means that the frequency for all the dominant alleles plus the frequency for the recessive alleles would equal 1, which is the total population.
Right.
And here's an example, like in a population of ferrets, the frequency for the dark fur, well, let's say it's 0.06, and the frequency for the lighter fur is 0.04.
Okay.
So it would be 0.06 being the Q and P and 0.04 being the Q, which is a total of 1 for the whole population. Now here's where we need to get on our mathematician hats. So it's a little
hats
tricky.
on.
Yeah.
All right.
Take a look at this equation. P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equal 1.
That's complicated.
Yes.
All right.
We use the allele frequencies just stated to calculate the genotype frequencies. So using the example of the ferrets, if P represents the frequency of the dark allele, we'll use uppercase D for that.
All right.
For the dominant allele, and the proportion of the population would, the proportion, of the population with genotype DD is the P squared.
Okay.
And then it's
ahead.
tricky, yeah. And then the proportion of the frequency with the less dominant allele, which is lowercase d, is the recessive allele. The population is the Q squared.
Yes.
And then the center part of the equation, the 2PQ, that calculates the heterozygous class, which is the part of the has 2 different alleles.
Right.
The gene possessing the 2 different alleles.
Right. So this is what we learned about in class last week, right?
Yeah, with the dominant, the dominant and the
exactly.
recessive alleles.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah. So that should help in this next equation.
Okay.
This is showing what the equation would look like using the population of ferrets.
Okay.
So we'll just take a look at the slide.
Yeah.
Which it shows if you take the 0.6 for the dominant fur, squared, it's 0.36. And Q squared, the recessive allele, is 4 squared, which is 0.16, and then 2 times the P and the Q is 0.48, which equals 1.
Once again, awesome. Yeah.
So in the next generation, this shows that, oh gosh, where are my notes? I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah, no, that shows, that's right. The frequencies of the
homozygous.
Dominant individuals plus the heterozygote plus the homozygous recessive all add up to the total population.
Awesome.
Right. But in the next generation, when the ferrets produce gametes, which are the sperm or the egg cells, the frequency of the dominant allele will be the sum of the homozygous dominant and then half the gametes from the heterozygotes.
Okay.
Which, in this case, is 36 plus 24 being half of the heterozygous one, which comes to 0.60 again. So back to the original equation, P plus Q equals 1. If P is 0.6, then Q has to be 0.4, and we're right back where we began.
Yeah.
Which means that as far as Hardy-Weinberg go, evolution does not occur. As we were saying earlier when I was stating the conditions of Hardy-Weinberg, in reality that doesn't happen. In a real population, most of their conditions are not met.
Right.
Like we were talking about.
Yeah.
And an allele frequency will change if even one of those conditions are violated. And obviously this happens in real life when mutations are introduced, introduce new alleles, or individuals remain in close groups mating among themselves. Obviously individuals migrate in and out of populations, as we stated. And natural selection definitely occurs in reality.
Right.
So, so in the human population, no population is infinitely large as well. So this means that evolution in real population is inevitable.
Limit to our resources and excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Now you would think that the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is useless since we know that these conditions can't be met.
Right.
But that's not the case. They say we still use that for a basis of comparison when we want to show microevolution, when microevolution occurs. So we still do need their information in the long run.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, excellent.
So, any more questions for me?
I don't think so. I think you answered them all. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Susan. And
Thanks
really
for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, that'll be all for this section, and we'll see you in a minute. Wow, that was awesome. So congratulations. You've made it officially halfway through today's video, and if you're awake, stay awake. If you're asleep, wake up. Now I'm going to cover my own section, 11.4, which talks about how natural selection can influence a population. It was the only section I really felt like I understood well enough to be able to cover with you guys without bringing in professional help, so I hope it all goes well and it makes sense to you. We've talked about survival of the fittest and how organisms with a better phenotypes have a better chance to reproduce. It makes sense that this would have an effect on how a population looks. And scientists have created categories to help be specific when discussing natural selection in this manner. Natural selection is by far the most important way a population can evolve. In fact, it's probably the only way. And as we know, but just to reiterate, natural selection changes the genetic makeup of a population by favoring alleles that contribute to reproductive success. And so, it would only make sense that organisms with phenotypes that are poorly suited for their environment are less likely to survive. You got that? So, keeping that in mind, let's talk. The first type of selection is called directional selection. And that happens when the environment is selective to organisms with one extreme phenotype. As I believe Robert Benjamin talked about earlier, the peppered moths were found in both dark and light varieties before the Industrial Revolution. And then during and after the Industrial Revolution, the colors of the trees began to change because of all the smog caused by the factories. Because of this change in environment, the environment began to favor the darker moths, while the lighter moths stood out like a sore thumb on the dark trees, and therefore stood out more easily to predators. So birds ate the light moths, didn't eat the dark moths. You see what happens. The dark moths died and were not able to reproduce, so their population decreased. Whereas the darker moths were able to reproduce, there were lots of them, they blended in, and therefore their population increased. Now, we have to keep in mind that oftentimes the initial population for the extreme phenotype is initially very small. But as reproduction continues and natural selection takes its course, the population will increase. The second type of selection is called disruptive selection. Disruptive selection occurs when a kindergarten class is given injections of caffeine and is set loose in a retail store, mall, or office. Just kidding! Disruptive selection is when two or more phenotypes are more fit than the average phenotype. So it's like directional selection, but with two phenotypes instead of one. And in this case, the phenotypes are on both extremes of the scale. You have, one extreme and then the other extreme, and in the average is no bueno. You don't want to be in the average. You want to be in one extreme or the other extreme. So, an example of this would be the marine snails that live on rocks surrounding islands. These rocks are usually very dark in color and have white barnacles attached to them. As you can imagine, if you're a snail and you have a dark colored shell or a white colored shell, it's good for you. You can blend in with the rocks, no problem. Camouflage. No one's going to be able to see you. Live your life happily and die happily. However, if you have a tan shell, a brown shell, anything but white or dark, anything in the middle here that's average, it's bad news bears for you. You're probably going to be eaten and you'll die soon, and it's no good. So that is disruptive selection. The third type of selection is called stabilized selection. Stabilized selection is when an average phenotype is the most fit for survival, while extreme phenotypes are less likely to survive. It's basically the opposite of disruptive selection. You want to be in the middle. If you're in either extreme, that's no good. A good example of this would be human babies. Babies are adorable, cute. Everyone loves babies. But they're also a good example for stabilized selection. Babies with an average weight are usually the healthiest, while babies with a lower and higher weight are not as healthy. Naturally, stabilized selection is found in populations that are stable, as it tends to reduce extreme variation in populations. Makes sense to me. For some genes, natural selection maintains a balanced polymorphism. This is a really long word. It comes from the Latin, and it means multiple forms. Basically, polymorphism is where multiple alleles of a gene continue indefinitely in a population at an almost constant frequency. In this, even alleles that are harmful may continue in a population. What's the deal, Mother Nature? I thought natural selection was supposed to be a good thing. Well, as it turns out, the bad things can also be good things. It's confusing. But remember earlier in bio class when we talked about sickle cell disease? It has a lot of disadvantages. Your spleen's gonna swell, your joints are gonna be in pain, you'll probably die young from a disease as your immune system's suppressed and unable to fight off diseases. However, it does have one huge advantage. You can't get malaria. You may think, malaria? We live in the United States. We have clean drinking water. We're fine. Why is malaria relevant? Well, if you live in Africa, malaria is a big issue, and especially in some parts. So, it's really vital for them to have this sickle cell disease in their genes. You're hoping that you're going to be heterozygous for this gene and not homozygous, so you can have the advantages without having the disadvantages. Now, the other bad thing about this is that if you have two parents that are both heterozygous, they still carry the sickle cell gene in recessive. So, if they have a kid, the kid has a 25% chance of having homozygous sickle cell. That's not good. But that's the best we can do right now. So, thank you so much for listening. And I'm off to Mexico now to meet with Dr. Alex Albericin to talk more about the forces of evolutionary change. Today, I invited Professor Alexander Albericin. He's part of a group of other scientists and experts in evolution, and more importantly, in the forces of evolutionary change. He's going to speak with us today, and hopefully we'll learn something very life-changing from him. All right, how you doing today, Alex?
I'm fine, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. The pleasure is mine. So Professor, you're part of the group that deals with the forces of evolutionary change.
Yes.
Yes. And you actually have two areas of focus. Section 11.5, sexual selection influences reproductive success, and 11.7, investigating life, size matters in fishing frenzy.
Right again.
All right, very interesting. Let's talk about sexual selection. What is sexual selection? It sounds very risque. I don't mean to be forward, but what is it?
Okay. First thing one should know is that sexual selection contradicts everything that is said about natural selection.
Oh, okay. All right then. How is that possible though?
Well, in natural selection, we learn the specimens that are able to adapt to their environment are able to survive. And in one way or another, and one way they are able to survive is by blending with their environments, by blending into their environments in order to escape predators.
That's right. I remember one of your colleagues talking about that.
Yes. That's right. Alright, so look at these pictures. I want you to tell me if you can differentiate between the females and the males.
They're both dogs. I have no idea which one is which.
Okay, how about
the next one?
picture?
Yeah. Yeah, they look the same to me. I don't know. Alright, what about the next one?
Okay, the next one. Just a last try.
I have no idea. What are you doing to me, Alex? This is difficult.
Well, it's not supposed to be easy.
Oh, never is. Alright. That's not fair though. I mean, you should have at least given me some chance. I mean, those animals look basically the same.
Exactly. You will need to take a closer look in order to differentiate between the females and the males.
Alright. So, you just frustrating me for your amusement? Come on, Alex.
Well, I'm a scientist. I need to find ways to have fun.
Can you spell desperate?
Okay. Let's play again. And I promise this time it will be a lot easier.
Alright, let's do this.
Alright. Now I'm going to show you another set of pictures, and I want you to tell me, do the same thing. I want you to tell me which one is the male and which one is the female.
Alright. Alright, that one's the male and that one's the female.
How can you tell?
The male has more hair.
You mean the mane?
Yeah, the mane has a mane. It has more hair on its mane.
Okay.
Or it has a mane, the other one doesn't.
Alright. Good, good. I'll accept that.
Yeah.
Okay. How about this one?
I'm gonna say this is the male and this is the female.
Why?
Because the male has brighter colors, maybe for mating, and the female doesn't, probably for camouflage.
Okay, okay.
I don't know.
Let's go with the next one. This one.
Okay. For that one, the one with the antlers is the male, and the one without are not.
Alright. Very good. You just redeemed yourself from your previous attack.
Yes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how it's done.
So can you tell me why the second set was a lot easier than the first set?
Because in the first set, the males look completely similar to the females.
Mm-hmm.
And in the second set, the males had something that distinguished them from the females.
Exactly, and that's what we call sexual dimorphism.
Sexual dimorphism? That sounds... I don't even know.
Well, sexual dimorphism is when animals have distinctive characteristics that differentiate between the male and the females.
Ah, like humans.
Humans.
Alright, yeah.
This could be the difference in size, colors, having antlers, horns, breast, or
Yeah.
a penis.
Ah, nice.
Yes.
Like birds, like they have different colors, right? Yeah.
Yeah, birds are a good example. Let's look at the male cardinal.
Alright, male cardinal? Yeah. Well, check that out.
The red feathers on the male make it stand out,
Yeah.
which makes it easier for predators to spot the red feathered cardinals, male
Mhm.
cardinals. This makes it easier to be eaten and then distinguished.
Mm-hmm. That's not very advantageous for them, is it?
Oh, no, it's not.
And the males that don't have... Wait, but... A right and logical conclusion would be that because the cardinals are bright red, that they're also... mates are easier... mates have an easier time spotting them, right?
Yes. Actually.
Yeah. And males that don't have the red feathers wouldn't be able to reproduce, right?
Yeah, because predators will look for the red feathers.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But the population of red cardinals isn't extinct, nor is even in danger of extinction.
That's right.
So why is that?
Well, because female cardinals prefer red cardinals. The brighter the colors, the more attractive the male looks.
Ah, maybe I should get some red tanning done. I don't know.
Unless you're trying to create a new species, I suggest you do that.
Yeah, probably not. Well, yeah, I guess it doesn't work for humans, does it?
No, it doesn't.
That's a bummer.
This is what we call intersexual selection.
Intrasexual selection?
No, intersexual selection.
Oh, intersexual selection. This sounds probably less risque than the other one, but
Alright.
what is intrasexual selection?
Intersexual selection is one of the two forms of sexual selection. Intersexual selection is when one gender tries to appeal to the opposite gender, let it be by sound, looks, and smell.
Very interesting. So is that why you're wearing cologne today?
Can you tell?
I'm just kidding. Now, you mentioned two forms. We already talked about intersexual selection. So what's the other form?
Intrasexual selection.
Intrasexual selection, okay. And how does intrasexual selection work?
Intersexual selection works when males of a species compete amongst each other to see who's the strongest.
Arm wrestle?
Arm wrestle.
Alright, let's do it. 3, 2, 1, go! He wins.
Say, I'll survive, he will die. Nice one, nice one.
So what species would be a good example of that, aside from us just arm wrestling?
Lions.
Lions, all right.
Lions form groups called pride.
Okay.
Now, in each pride, there's many females, but just a handful of males. And the males, and that's why the males compete amongst each other to see who's the strongest, the alpha male.
Okay, the alpha male. And that's pretty amazing. I noticed that only the males work. They work really hard to attract the females, but the females really don't do anything to try to attract the males. Are they just lazy? Are they really picky? Or are they just bad at attracting males? I don't know.
I'm not sure about being lazy or bad, but you are right when you say they're picky.
Okay.
Alright. In most cases, females look for the strongest males, or the males with the brightest colors, or because these are good signs of good genes or good health.
And that's why neon green always comes into fashion. All right.
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah. It's like high school with all the bright colors.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Those were dark times, everybody.
For you, maybe. I was fine. Except for arm wrestling, but I was fine.
Okay. Let's not brag about it and let's go back in time.
Alright, let's go on, Professor.
Alright. You see, females want offspring to have good genes, and that's why that's why they're very picky.
Okay.
Males, on the other hand, they don't seem to care how the females look.
Like you in high school.
Yeah, like me in high school.
Fascinating. Alright, well that'd be all for section 11.5. We'll be back with Professor Albericin to talk about section 11.7 right here, or right over there, after we're finished talking with your other colleagues. And thank you so much for coming on the show. We look forward to seeing you in a few minutes.
Alright, I'll be waiting.
Alright, I'm going to cover chapter 11.6, how evolution occurs in several ways. Today I'm going to discuss 4 more ways evolution occurs: genetic drift, mutation, non-random mating, and gene flow.
Okay.
Natural selection is responsible for adaptations that enhance and reproduce.
Alright.
Each of these ways affect evolution in a specific manner. First, I want to talk about how it affects mutation. In order to understand how a mutation evolves, I want to cover what mutation is.
Alright, so what is a mutation?
A mutation is a change in the organism's DNA sequence that introduces a new allele to the population.
Alright, so why are mutations important?
Mutations are the raw material for evolution because genes contribute to phenotypes and natural selection acts on phenotypes.
Right, like we learned about in class today. Okay, excellent. So, could you give me an example of this?
For example, random mutations in bacterial DNA may change the shape of key proteins in the cell walls.
Okay.
Exposure to these antibiotics selects some of the new phenotypes if they cause to make the cell resistant to the drug. In that case, the mutation will pass on to the next generation.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Is there anything that people often don't understand about mutations?
A common misconception is that a mutation produces an adaptation exactly when a population needs it to confront a new environmental challenge.
Okay. Can you give me an example of that?
For example, people mistakenly believe that antibiotics create resistance, but that resistance arises in bacteria in response to the exposure of the drugs.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Do the genes know when to mutate, or is it a random thing?
No. genes don't know when to mutate. The chance
Okay.
of a mutation will occur will, is independent of whether a new phenotype would benefit the organism.
Oh, okay. So it changes depending on the animal.
Yeah.
All right. Or organism, rather.
Yes.
So does this happen like at a constant rate, or is it shifting, or what's the deal with that?
The rate at which a mutation occurs, both among different genes within a gene.
Okay.
The average rate is around 1 DNA sequence per 10 per 9 base pairs.
Okay.
That number may seem low to pose a significant impact in evolution. However, each genome has an enormous amount of base pairs, and large numbers of cell division occurs throughout life.
Okay. So how would this work in us?
During the human lifespan, for example, about 175 new mutations are estimated to occur in each person's genome.
Wow. Okay. So does this affect people over the long term, or is this more of a short-term thing?
The mutation, it affects evolution only if the subsequent generations inherit it.
No. Okay. Does this work in all cases, or?
In asexual reproducing organisms such as bacteria, each mutated cell gives rise to a mutant offspring.
Okay.
In a multicellular organism, however, a mutation can pass from generation only if it arises from a germ cell.
Interesting. Okay. So, are there any other ways that evolution occurs?
Another way evolution occurs is through a genetic drift.
What's a genetic drift?
A genetic drift is a change in the allele sequence purely by chance.
Okay, so very random.
Yes. Unlike its counterpart, a mutation which increases diversity, genetic drift tends to eliminate all alleles from a population. All forms of genetic drift are rooted in sampling error, which happens when a sample does not match the larger group from which it is drawn.
Okay.
After all, the event of meiosis, which ensures that each allele has only a 50% chance of passing to each of their offspring.
Okay, what are the causes of genetic drift?
One cause of the genetic drift is the founder effect.
Mm-hmm.
The founder effect occurs when a small group leaves its home population and moves into a new established isolated settlement. The small group may not have some of the traits that were rare in the original population that might be more frequent in the new population. For example, the Amish people of Pennsylvania back in the 1700s immigrated to North America from Switzerland.
Oh, yeah.
One couple who immigrated just happened to carry the recessive allele associated with Ellis von Creveld syndrome.
Sounds interesting. Amish people don't live with the modern stuff. Pretty crazy. So, what are the effects of genetic drift?
The effects of genetic drift it's called the bottleneck effect. The bottleneck effect is basically when the population drops rapidly over a short period of time, causing the loss of many alleles that were previously present in the larger ancestral population.
Okay, so this is sort of like backtracking. This is like opposite evolution. Can you give me an example of this?
Yes. Cheetahs are undergoing a current population bottleneck. Until 10,000 years ago, these cats were common. Today there are just two isolated populations. They live in South and East Africa, numbering only a few thousand.
Wow. So, are there any other factors that contribute to this process?
Non-random mating can only occur if the hardy equilibrium. A population must have a completely random mating in which each individual has an equal chance of mating with another member of the population.
Wow, that's ridiculous. That's like me meeting a random person from a country on the other side of the world, and then not only us meeting, but then us mating. That's crazy, right?
Yeah, I know.
So,
in reality, choosing your mate is rarely random. For
Yeah.
example, us humans, when we choose our mates, we give great consideration. It is hardly random.
yeah.
So many factors go into choosing their mate, such as having the same common hobbies, communication,
Yeah, exactly. Language
etc.
barriers. Yeah.
So many. Now, because of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, no alleles are allowed to move out or leave the population.
Yeah. So like, how does this happen? Like,
Gene flow moves alleles across among the population.
how does this physically happen? Is there a process that it has to go through?
Migration is one common way that gene flow occurs. Departing members of a population take their alleles with them. Likewise, new members of the population enter and inbreed with an existing population, may add new alleles.
Okay. But is gene flow, in that case, gene flow is different from the others in that it doesn't require the movement of individuals.
Yes, yes.
Excellent. So, how is gene flow different from both natural selection and genetic drift? Are there any other ways?
Gene flow can counteract the effect of both natural selection and genetic drift.
Oh wow, so it's like totally opposite.
Yeah,
Is there like an example of this?
yes. Isolated European populations had unique alleles for many genetic diseases. Geographical barriers such as large bodies of water have restricted migration and kept the gene pool separate.
But that's not the case today, right?
Even gene flow should make these regional, however, high trains. Wouldn't do that again.
Just, no, don't worry about it.
However, high trains.
Highways? Keep going, man. Highways.
However, highways, trains, and have eliminated physical barriers of migration. Even gene flow should make these regional differences disappear.
Okay, so we've seen how natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, mutations, and non-random mating disrupt the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and bring about evolutionary change in our world today. Thank you so much, Adam, for being on the show.
No problem.
Then finally, I traveled back to Mexico to meet with Professor Alex one last time. And here's what he had to say. Welcome back, everybody, to the show, and welcome back, Professor. It's good to have you again.
All right, glad to be back.
Yeah. Now, earlier today, I mentioned that you have two sections you focused on. We covered the first one earlier. It was on 11.5, sexual selection. We talked about that. It was good. We had a good time together. And the other is 11.7, investigating life, size matters in fishing frenzy. The title seems a bit confusing. So what's it focusing on?
Well, section 11.7 talks about we as humans are affecting the natural selection. In some level, are affecting natural selection.
Okay. But how is that possible?
Well, remember, natural selection says that the strongest will survive. That is, if no outside forces intervenes.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Now think about fishes like tuna and swordfish. They're very delicious.
Yeah, aren't they?
Yeah, sure. Okay, let's go back to the topic. So let's not deviate. Alright, remember that decades ago, when we were young, they were larger, bigger, and now they are smaller, significantly smaller. They're getting smaller.
Huh. Yeah, I guess that's true. Why is that?
Well, biologically speaking, we are killing biologically speaking, larger fish are dying faster than they can reproduce, thus allowing the smaller fish to reproduce.
But you said that we as humans affect this natural selection.
Yeah, I did.
Okay. So how do we exactly affect it? Like in what way?
Because we eat fish.
Ha! I'm sure you're not subjecting that we stop eating fish. So you're suggesting
no,
you wouldn't
I'm
suggest
not.
that.
I'm
I
not.
love my salmon, so.
Well, that'll make two of us.
Yeah.
Now remember, we tend to prefer bigger fishes. We pay for larger portions. So in order to supply our demands, fishermen has to need bigger ships and more frequent trips in order to supply our demands.
In other words, we're taking out of the vast ocean, we're taking out the biggest fish. We're taking them out of the pool or ocean.
Exactly. And in doing so, we are allowing the small fish, who are genetically smaller, to reproduce.
I see. So the answer would be to start hunting the smaller fish instead of the bigger ones.
Could be, but it's not that simple.
Why is that?
Because to prevent us from hunting down a species to the near extinction, we tend to put restrictions, and we have fishing regulations. These regulations prevent us from taking in the small fish. The fish need to be a certain size or age in order to be captured and sold.
I see what you're saying. So smaller fish are reproducing, the offspring would not be bigger than their predecessors. So, the parents, or if their parents are small, they can't have two small fish, they can't have a big fish. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So what should we do?
Well, like you mentioned before, we need another regulation that prevent us from capturing fish that have reached a certain height, a maximum size limit, if you will.
And you think this maximum limit regulation could solve the problem?
Well, let me tell you about an experiment conducted by David Conover and Stefan Munch, two fish ecologists from the State University of New York.
Awesome.
Alright, so what they did was set up 6 tanks full of fish. 2 of the tanks were large harvested, meaning they will remove 90% of the population, leaving behind the small fish to reproduce. Another were the small harvesters, where they will remove 90% of the population, leaving behind the big fish to reproduce. The last 2 where they remove 90% of the population randomly, no matter the size of the fish. They call it the random harvested, also known as the control group. They follow this procedure for 4 generations of fish.
And what happened?
Well, the results were as you would have predicted.
Okay.
Let's look at the graph. In the red line, also known as the large harvested, the initial population was bigger. By the 4th generation, the fish were significantly smaller due to the fact that competition for survival has decreased. On the other hand, in the small harvesters, also known as the blue line, the 4th generation was much bigger than the initial population. That is because the fish needed to grow faster in order to survive.
Very interesting. So, what could these results mean?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, a maximum size limit and a minimum size limit could save the small and big fish and their genes that are necessary for future generations. Also, the maximum size limit could also have ecological benefits.
What kind of benefits are we talking about?
Well, for once, it could restore the feeding patterns of other fish and other ecosystems as well, for that are necessary for larger fish.
Okay. So, do you believe that in doing so we can have big fish again?
I hope so. I love my fish.
I love my fish.
Let's just
Yeah.
remember, it's all part of natural selection.
It's true. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Professor. You've been more than informative to us for
Oh.
both of these sections.
Pleasure's mine.
Yeah. Well, folks, we'll be back next week or not with more interesting news. Take care, everybody. Thank you for joining me as I explored Chapter 11, all about the forces of evolutionary change. Thank you, and have a good night.